Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation to join this panel with such knowledgeable colleagues. To be honest, it's a bit terrifying being the only regulator on the panel, but in for a penny, in for a pound, as we say in the UK. And I thought that I might try and mount a bit of a defence of ex-ante regulation on behalf of some of the regulators in the room, because perhaps not surprisingly, it has got something of a bad report over the last couple of days. And I'm going to do that by sharing some of the experiences in the UK of ex-ante and ex-post regulation. So a couple of sentences just by way of context. Ofcom in the UK is a converged industry regulator for telecoms, post and broadcast. We have concurrent competition powers for these markets alongside the Competition Market Authority, the CMA. In practice, the CMA's main intervention in our markets has been in relation to mergers. It has sole jurisdiction over domestic mergers in the UK, but defers, at least at present, to the European Commission for mergers with a pan-European dimension. In practice, Ofcom has acted as an advisor to both the CMA and the Commission on mergers, and we have had two significant recent examples. Firstly, the merger of BT with a large mobile MNO EE, which was allowed by the CMA, and secondly, the proposed merger of 3 and O2, who you would know as Hutchinson and Telefonica, which was ultimately blocked by the Commission. I'm going to spend most of my time, in fact almost all of my time, really talking about the fixed market in the UK. So just to explain why, in reality that is where most of our experience of ex-ante and ex-post ex-ante regulation has been. And that is because in our mobile markets we have no incumbent, pretty significant competition, and therefore low retail prices. In fact, and I know this has been picked up by other colleagues during the week, probably the main concerns in our mobile market has been that competition has reached its limit in terms of promoting coverage for those relatively small parts of the country which are left, and so more of the focus is on other kinds of interventions through coverage obligations in auctions and so on, rather than regulation. I could talk about some of the regulatory issues on the media side, but those of you who are at the Regulatory Forum will know that I've done one panel on net neutrality this week, and I thought I would allow myself some time off from it today. So moving on to ex-ante regulation in the fixed world then. So in Europe, the European Commission has set out a recommendation on markets where ex-ante regulation is presumed to be justified. And the formal framework is then governed by 3 criteria, which says that ex-ante regulation may be used where there are high and non-transitory barriers to entry, the market does not trend towards competition, effective competition, and general competition law is insufficient. They are pretty broad, but as we might expect, since 2006, the number of markets that the Commission has identified as likely to be, where ex-ante intervention is likely to be justified, has shrunk considerably. And in particular, it's shifted really entirely to wholesale markets rather than wholesale and retail, as was the case in the past. And this is clearly consistent with the principle that we should be able to rely more on ex-post regulation as our markets mature. So why do I think ex-ante regulation is still relevant in the UK context at least? So we consider that ex-ante intervention does still have an important role to play, in particular in supporting industry evolution and delivering the wider benefits of competition and investment rather than through a focus on short-term prices. 10 to 15 years ago in the UK, our focus was on shifting, really, the focus of competition from the resale of BT's network by multiple resellers, so BT being our fixed incumbent, and there being many, many resellers for their products, to competition-based, by which we meant unbundling BT's copper network and having much deeper competition between fewer scale players. And that's proved very successful in the UK. We have 4 major retail players, together with a cable and now fibre competitor in Virgin Media. And we have seen the rollout of super fast speeds to 95% of premises in the UK, and relatively low prices when we compare ourselves internationally. At the time, 10 to 15 years ago, that approach was very much based on the fact that we didn't think that network infrastructure competition was viable. We thought the barriers to entry were too high and the business case was not sufficiently sound. Now, 10 to 15 years later, we think that the time is right to focus on promoting infrastructure competition, specifically to support the rollout of fibre to the premises, which currently has very low penetration in the UK, around 4% of premises. So we are now focusing our ex-ante interventions on reducing barriers to entry for network infrastructure builders. And that is largely being done through mandating access to BT's ducts and poles, while continuing to support retail competition during the transition. Interestingly, our mobile providers are also very supportive of proposals around duct and pole access, because they consider it will help them to get the fibre they need for mobile backhaul for 5G rollout. We're also looking to increase the certainty for investment by moving away from our current 3-year market review cycles to 5 years. And we think that's very important in enabling investors to feel they have more regulatory certainty. I think it is important to say that whilst we do believe that ex-ante regulation has a really important role to play in the coming years, we are actively looking for opportunities to deregulate, and we have already indicated that where we succeed in getting genuine network competition, perhaps with 3 infrastructure providers in place, we would look to deregulate and rely on ex post, although we recognise this is unlikely to be the case in the whole of the UK. Perhaps more controversially, or at least in a more difficult space, we will also consider using ex-ante powers to prevent dominant players from stifling competition in its infancy. This is clearly controversial, and we need to tread cautiously. But we have evidence that ex-post intervention is just not always sufficient in these cases. Recently, we carried out a significant investigation, resulting in a large fine, although now heading to court against Royal Mail, our incumbent postal provider, for stifling competition in relation to a competitor called Whistle. By the time that investigation was complete, Whistle had been out of business for 3 or 4 years. So, in summary, I think what I want to say is that we don't use ex-ante powers lightly, and we certainly continue to look for opportunities to deregulate. However, we do think they have a continuing role to play, and I don't believe that regulators should shy away from using them when there's benefit for consumers. I look forward to the debate.